President Jake Morrison stood in the Oval Office, staring at the strange crystal device on his desk. The thing had appeared out of nowhere 3 hours ago, humming with an alien energy that made his teeth ache. Now it was glowing bright blue, and speaking in a voice that sounded like grinding metal mixed with the whisper of wind through caves. The Galactic Tribunal summons the species known as humanity to appear before the Court of 12 Worlds, the voice said for the third time. You are charged with excessive aggression and violation of civilized warfare protocols. Your representative must appear within 7 standard galactic days or face immediate sanctions. Morrison rubbed his temples and looked across the room at Admiral Lisa Carter, who was recording everything on her tablet. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set in that stubborn way he knew meant she was ready for a fight. Defense Secretary Ryan Walsh paced near the windows, his hands clasped behind his back, while Chief of Staff Amanda Brooks sat quietly in her chair, already making notes about what this would mean for Earth's future. Tell me again what happened. At Kepler Colony, Morrison said, though he already knew the story by heart. Carter cleared her throat. The Scar Empire sent a fleet to claim the colony. They said we had no right to settle there because it was in their expansion zone. When we refused to leave, they attacked. We had maybe 3,000 colonists and a small defense force against their battle fleet of 60 ships. Walsh stopped pacing and turned toward them. Any normal military force would have surrendered when they saw those odds. The Star probably expected us to give up without much of a fight. But we didn't, Morrison said quietly. No, sir, we didn't, Carter replied. The colonists fought like their lives depended on it because they did. They used mining equipment as weapons, turned their farming robots into soldiers, and when the Star landed ground troops, every man, woman, and teenager who could hold a gun joined the fight. Morrison remembered reading the reports. The colonists had done things that would have been impossible for any other species in the galaxy. They had rigged explosives in their own buildings, used children as messengers through battlefield zones, and kept fighting even when their defeat seemed certain. When the battle was over, the mighty Star Fleet was in ruins and the humans were still standing. The other alien species think we're crazy, Brooks said from her chair. They've been calling us the species that doesn't know when to quit in their diplomatic messages. The crystal device pulsed again and Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. He had been president for 6 years now, had dealt with economic crashes, natural disasters, and even the first contact with alien civilizations 5 years ago. Nothing had prepared him for this moment when humanity itself was being put on trial by creatures they barely understood. What do we know about this tribunal? He asked. Carter scrolled through her tablet. According to our alien contacts, it's made up of 12 of the oldest species in the galaxy. They've been running things for about 10,000 years, making rules about how wars should be fought and how conflicts should be resolved. They have some kind of system where battles are supposed to follow certain patterns and armies surrender when the math says they can't win. Like a chess game, Walsh muttered. Exactly like a chess game, Carter agreed. Apparently most galactic warfare works this way. You line up your fleets, calculate who has the advantage, and the weaker side gives up before too many people die. It keeps things orderly and prevents the kind of total wars that could destroy entire star systems. Morrison walked to the window and looked out at the White House lawn where his security team was still searching for any sign of how the crystal device had appeared. The alien technology was beyond anything human science could explain, which made him wonder what other surprises these tribunal species might have waiting for them. They're scared of us, he said suddenly. The room went quiet. Brooks stopped writing and looked up at him. Sir? Think about it, Morrison continued. We've been in space for less than 200 years. We've colonized 30 worlds and made contact with dozens of alien species. Every time someone tries to push us around, we push back harder. We don't follow their rules because we never agreed to their rules, Carter nodded slowly. The Kepler battle wasn't just about one colony. It was about proving that humans won't be bullied by anyone, no matter how big their fleet is. And now they want to put us in our place, Walsh added. Make an example of us so other young species don't get any ideas about fighting back. Morrison turned away from the window and looked at his team. These were good people, smart people who had helped him navigate the challenges of leading humanity into the galactic community. Now that community was turning against them, and he had to decide how to respond. What happens if we don't go to this trial? He asked. Brooks consulted her notes. According to the message, they'll impose sanctions. That could mean anything from trade restrictions to military blockades. If they're as powerful as they claim, they could cut us off from the rest of the galaxy. And if we do go, we get to make our case, Carter said. Try to explain why we fought the way we did. Maybe convince them that we're not the monsters they think we are. Morrison picked up the crystal device, feeling its alien warmth against his palms. The thing was beautiful in its way, like holding a piece of trapped starlight. But it represented something ugly, the demand that humanity bow down to authorities they had never chosen and follow rules they had never agreed to accept. Set up a meeting with the full cabinet, he said finally, and get me everything we have on these 12 tribunal species. I want to know who we're dealing with before we walk into their courtroom. The crystal device pulsed one more time and then went dark as if it had delivered its message and no longer cared what humanity decided to do about it. Morrison set it back on his desk and looked around the room at the faces of the people who would help him decide the future of their species. 7 days to prepare for the most important trial in human history. 7 days to figure out how to defend their right to exist as free people in a galaxy that seemed determined to make them submit. Morrison had faced difficult decisions before, but nothing like this. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option. The tribunal chamber was unlike anything President Jake Morrison had ever seen. The massive structure floated in the void of space around a dying star, its crystalline walls stretching for miles in every direction. Through the transparent sections, he could see the twisted shapes of alien vessels from dozens of different species, all waiting to witness humanity's judgment. Morrison walked beside Ambassador Helen Stone through corridors that seemed to bend and flow like living tissue. The floors beneath their feet pulsed with soft light that responded to their footsteps, and the air tasted of metal and ozone. Behind them, Colonel Brad Johnson and his security team moved quietly, their hands never far from their weapons even. Though they knew those weapons would be useless here. Remember, Stone whispered as they approached the main chamber, show respect but not fear. These beings have been ruling the galaxy since before humans discovered fire, but they're still just people like us? Morrison nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. The few glimpses he had caught of the tribunal members suggested they were anything but human. The Veltari prosecutor who would be presenting the case against humanity was a creature made of living crystal, its body shifting between solid and liquid states as it moved. The other judges were equally alien, gas beings from the outer worlds, insect creatures the size of small buildings, and things that existed in dimensions human eyes couldn't properly see. The main chamber opened up before them like the inside of a giant egg. Floating platforms hung suspended in the air at different levels, each one holding one of the 12 tribunal members. At the center of the space was a single platform where Morrison and his team would make their stand. The architecture itself was designed to make visitors feel small and helpless, surrounded by ancient powers that could crush them without effort. High Arbiter Zexhai of the Veltari rose from its platform, its crystalline body catching the light from the dying star outside. When it spoke, its voice resonated through the chamber like the sound of breaking glass mixed with singing crystal. The species known as humanity stands accused of violating the sacred laws of civilized warfare, it announced. For 10,000 years, the galaxy has known peace because all intelligent species have agreed to follow the protocols of honorable combat. Wars are fought with calculation and precision, casualties are minimized, and surrender is accepted when defeat becomes mathematically certain. Morrison listened as the prosecutor displayed holographic images of the battle at Kepler Colony. The images showed human defenders fighting in ways that clearly disturbed the alien judges. Children carrying ammunition through combat zones, civilians building bombs in their homes, wounded soldiers refusing medical evacuation to continue fighting. To human eyes, these were acts of courage and determination. To the tribunal, they looked like the actions of madmen. Observe how these humans fight, Sci-Fi continued. They ignore tactical logic, refuse reasonable surrender terms, and involve non-combatants in military actions. Their emotional decision-making process corrupts the orderly resolution of conflict. One by one, representatives from various alien species gave testimony against humanity. The insectoid hive queen Raotage spoke through a translation device that made her clicking sounds into words. She described how her species had studied human military tactics and found them chaotic and unpredictable, like a disease that spreads disorder wherever it goes. The Ethrons, beings of living gas who existed in the atmospheres of giant planets, testified next. Their representative floated in a containment field that sparked with electrical discharges as it spoke. Humans make choices based on emotion, rather than logic, it said. This emotional contamination threatens the stability of all galactic civilization. But the most damaging testimony came from Warlord Scran himself, the reptilian commander whose fleet had been defeated at Kepler. Morrison had expected the alien to be angry about his defeat, but instead Scran seemed genuinely frightened. His scaled hands shook as he described the battle. My forces surrounded the human colony completely, Scran said. According to all military doctrine, they should have surrendered immediately. Instead, they began fighting with a fury I have never witnessed in 40 years of warfare. They showed no fear of death, no respect for superior numbers, no understanding of when a battle is lost. The warlord paused and looked directly at Morrison. I have fought against the greatest warriors in the galaxy, but humans fight like creatures possessed by demons. They refuse to accept defeat even when it is obvious to everyone else. How can you negotiate with beings who do not recognize the concept of logical surrender? Ambassador Stone rose to present humanity's defense, but Morrison could see that the tribunal had already made up their minds. The alien judges whispered among themselves in their various languages, their translation devices creating a chorus of disapproval. Some looked at the human delegation with what might have been pity, while others showed obvious disgust. Stone did her best to explain human culture and history. She spoke about humanity's long struggle for freedom, their fight against oppression. Throughout their history and their belief that some things were worth dying for, she showed images of human art, music, and literature that celebrated the courage of people who refused to give up against impossible odds. Humans have always been survivors, Stone said. We have faced extinction many times in our history, from ice ages to plagues to wars that consumed entire continents. Each time we survived because we refused to accept defeat. This is not madness or chaos, but the very essence of what makes us human. The tribunal members listened politely, but Morrison could see they were not convinced. To them, human determination looked like dangerous instability. Their civilization was built on order, predictability, and the acceptance of mathematical reality. The idea that someone would keep fighting when the numbers said they should surrender was not heroic but terrifying. High Arbiter's X-High called for a recess, and the floating platforms began to move away from the center of the chamber. Morrison watched them go and felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This trial was not about justice or understanding. It was about fear. These ancient species had built a galaxy-wide system of control based on everyone agreeing to fight by the same rules. Humanity threatened that system simply by existing. As the tribunal members disappeared into their private chambers to deliberate, Morrison turned to his team. Stone looked discouraged, Johnson was alert for any sign of threat, and the other members of their delegation seemed overwhelmed by the alien grandeur surrounding them. They're going to find us guilty, Morrison said quietly. Stone nodded. The question is what they'll do about it. The penalties could range from restrictions on our expansion to complete isolation from galactic civilization. Morrison looked up at the floating platforms where the most powerful beings in the galaxy were deciding humanity's fate. Tomorrow they would announce their judgment, and he would have to decide how to respond. The easy path would be to accept their decision and try to work within their system. The harder path was to reject their authority entirely and face the consequences, but as he stood in that vast chamber surrounded by the symbols of alien power, Morrison knew that humanity had not come this far by taking the easy path. President Jake Morrison could not sleep that night. He walked the corridors of the human diplomatic vessel UHS Washington, listening to the hum of the engines and the quiet conversations of his security team. Through the observation windows, he could see the strange alien ships that surrounded the tribunal station, their design so foreign that human eyes struggled to understand them. At 3 a.m, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He contacted the tribunal's information officer and requested access to their historical archives. Ambassador Stone had warned him that this might be seen as suspicious, but Morrison needed to understand who he was dealing with. The tribunal agreed to his request, probably thinking that a few hours of reading would not change the outcome of their trial. The archive chamber was a small room, filled with floating data crystals that responded to thought commands. Morrison sat in the center and began to explore the recorded history of galactic civilization. What he found in those glowing crystals shattered everything he thought he knew about the tribunal and their peaceful galaxy. The current galactic order had not been built through negotiation and wisdom, as the tribunal claimed. It had been forged in blood and fire during a series of devastating wars that had raged for over 1,000 years. The 12 species that now sat in judgment of humanity had once been just as aggressive and unpredictable as humans were accused of being. Morrison watched holographic records of ancient battles, where entire star systems had been destroyed by weapons that turned suns into bombs. He saw the wreckage of civilizations that had been completely wiped out, their planets left as dead rocks floating in space. The scale of destruction was beyond anything humanity had ever imagined, making their worst wars look like playground fights. The archives showed him the final war that had ended the Age of Chaos. It had started when the Veltari crystal beings had developed a weapon that could shatter planets with sound waves. The other species had responded by creating equally terrible weapons, and soon the galaxy was locked in a spiral of mutual destruction that threatened to kill every living thing in the known universe. The war had ended not through victory but through exhaustion. The surviving species had looked at the ruins of their civilizations and realized they had to find another way to resolve their conflicts. The tribunal system had been created as an alternative to total war, with complex rules designed to prevent future catastrophes. Morrison leaned back in his chair and felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The tribunal was not afraid of human aggression because it was wrong or evil. They were afraid because they had seen what happened when species like humanity were allowed to fight without limits. They had lived through the chaos, and they would do anything to prevent it from happening again, but there was more to the story. Morrison continued reading and discovered that the tribunal's peaceful system came with a terrible price. The rigid rules of civilized warfare had created a galaxy where the strong dominated the weak, through legal manipulation rather than honest conquest. Smaller species were systematically excluded from the tribunal's decisions, forced to accept the judgment of powers they had no voice in choosing. The archives contained thousands of cases where minor species had been stripped of their territory, their resources, and their freedom through tribunal decisions that followed the letter of galactic law while violating its spirit. The system worked to prevent galactic war, but it did so by creating a permanent hierarchy where the 12 founding species ruled over everyone else. Morrison's wrist communicator buzzed with an incoming message from Admiral Carter back on Earth. Her face appeared in a small hologram, and even across the vast distance of space, he could see the excitement in her eyes. "Mr. President, we've been contacted by representatives from 18 different species in the past 12 hours, she said. They all want to know if the rumors are true about humanity rejecting the tribunal's authority. Morrison sat up straighter. What rumors? Word is spreading that we're planning to withdraw from the galactic court system, regardless of their decision. These species want to know if we would be willing to share our military technology and tactical knowledge with them. The president felt his heart rate increase. Which species are we talking about? Carter consulted her notes. The Zephyrians from the rim worlds, the Aquatic Union from the water planets, the nomad fleets that live between the stars, and about 15 others. All of them are smaller powers that have been pushed around by the Tribunal for centuries. They're tired of having their fate decided by species they never agreed to follow. Morrison closed his eyes and tried to think through the implications. If humanity became the rallying point for dissatisfied species throughout the galaxy, it could trigger exactly the kind of chaos the Tribunal had been created to prevent. But if they submitted to the Tribunal's authority, they would be accepting a system that kept billions of beings under the control of 12 ancient powers. Admiral, I need you to do something for me, Morrison said. Contact these species unofficially and tell them we appreciate their interest. Don't make any commitments, but let them know we're considering all options. After the call ended, Morrison returned to the archives and began studying the current political situation in the galaxy. What he found was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Dozens of species were unhappy with the tribunal system but had never been strong enough to challenge it alone. Humanity's arrival on the galactic stage had given them hope that change might be possible. The human colonies were already becoming centers of innovation and free thinking that attracted beings from across the galaxy. Human universities were teaching alien students to question authority and think for themselves. Human businesses were operating on principles of fair trade and equal partnership that contrasted sharply with the exploitative practices of the major powers. Morrison realized that the Tribunal's real fear was not about military tactics or battlefield behavior. They were afraid that humanity's example would inspire other species to demand the same freedoms that humans took for granted. The trial was not about punishing past actions, but about preventing future rebellion. As dawn approached on the tribunal station, Morrison made his way to the observation deck where he could see the stars wheeling slowly past. He thought about his oath of office, his responsibility to protect and defend not just America but all of humanity. The decisions he made in the next few hours would echo through history for generations to come. Ambassador Stone found him there an hour later, looking tired but determined. She sat beside him and followed his gaze out into the star-filled darkness. The tribunal will announce their decision in 3 hours, she said quietly. Morrison nodded. I know what they're going to say. The question is how we respond. The safe choice would be to accept their restrictions and try to work within their system, Stone said. We could probably negotiate reasonable terms that would allow humanity to continue growing, just more slowly. And the unsafe choice? Stone was quiet for a long moment. Reject their authority completely. Form our own alliance with the species that want to join us. Create a new system based on actual representation and democratic principles. Morrison stood up and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cool metal. Out there in the darkness were 40 billion human beings living on dozens of worlds, all depending on him to make the right choice. Beyond them were countless other beings living under the thumb of powers they had never chosen to follow. Helen, he said finally, how do you think this tribunal would have judged George Washington? Stone smiled despite the seriousness of the moment. They would have called him a dangerous rebel who refused to accept the legitimate authority of the British Crown. Morrison turned back to face her, his decision made. Then I guess we know what we have to do. The tribunal chamber filled with alien beings from across the galaxy as the final session began. President Jake Morrison could feel their eyes on him as he walked to the defendant's platform, their attention like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. The 12 judges floated on their platforms above him, ancient and powerful beings who had ruled the galaxy since before humanity had learned to write. High. Arbiter Zexhai rose from its crystalline throne, its body shifting between solid and liquid states as it prepared to announce the tribunal's decision. But before it could speak, Morrison stepped forward and raised his hand. Your honors, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. Before you announce your judgment, I request permission to address this court personally. A murmur of surprise rippled through the watching aliens. Ambassador Stone looked shocked, and Colonel Johnson's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. The tribunal members consulted among themselves in their various languages, clearly not expecting this development. Ze's highest crystalline features shifted into what might have been curiosity. This is highly irregular human president. Your representative has already presented your defense. I understand, Morrison replied calmly. But this trial is not just about one battle or one colony. It's about the future of galactic civilization itself. I believe I have something important to say that the court needs to hear. The alien judges whispered among themselves for several minutes before Zexai spoke again. Very well, you may address the tribunal, but keep your words brief. Our decision has already been made. Morrison walked to the center of the platform and looked up at the floating judges. These beings had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, had witnessed the birth and death of stars, had shaped the course of galactic history for 10,000 years. Now they were about to hear something that would challenge everything. They believed about justice and order. Your honors, Morrison began. I want to start by acknowledging the wisdom of your system and the peace it has maintained. For 10,000 years, you have prevented the kind of total wars that once threatened to destroy all life in the galaxy. This is an achievement that deserves respect and admiration. The judges seemed surprised by this approach. They had expected defiance or pleading, not praise for their accomplishments. Morrison could see some of them leaning forward with interest. However, he continued, I have spent the night studying your historical archives, and I have discovered something that troubles me deeply. Your system of civilized warfare has indeed prevented galactic war, but it has done so by creating something else, a permanent class system where 12 species rule over hundreds of others who have no voice in their own governance. Zexai's body flashed with angry light. You dare to criticize the foundations of galactic civilization? I dare to speak the truth, Morrison replied firmly. Your archives contain thousands of cases where smaller species have been stripped of their worlds, their resources, and their freedom through tribunal decisions they had no part in making. You call this peace, but I call it oppression with legal paperwork. Morrison activated a holographic projector that Ambassador Stone had given him, and images began to appear in the air around the chamber. The watching aliens gasped as they saw documentation of tribunal decisions over the centuries, showing how the system had been used to benefit the 12 ruling species at the expense of everyone else. The Kepler colony battle was not about human aggression, Morrison said as the images continued to display. It was about a people refusing to accept that their fate should be decided by powers they never agreed to follow. The Scar Empire claimed our colony because your tribunal gave them the right to expand into territories inhabited by younger species. Warlord Scran rose from his platform, his reptilian features twisted with rage. How dare you question the legal authority of the tribunal? Your species has been in space for barely 2 centuries. What right do you have to judge systems that have worked for millennia? Morrison turned to face the Star Commander directly. The same right that every intelligent being has, the right to determine their own destiny. You call your system legal, but law without representation is not justice. It's tyranny dressed up in fancy words. The chamber erupted in chaos as alien voices rose in protest and agreement. Some of the minor species representatives in the viewing galleries began to cheer, while the major powers shouted for order. Morrison could see that his words were having exactly the effect he had hoped for. They were forcing everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth about the galactic system. Zexai restored order by increasing the harmonic frequency of its voice until the sound forced everyone to stop talking. President Morrison, you are here to answer charges against humanity, not to put the tribunal itself on trial. Am I? Morrison asked. Because it seems to me that humanity is being judged not for what we did, but for what we represent. You're not afraid of our military tactics or our fighting spirit? You're afraid that other species will look at us and start asking why they should follow rules they never agreed to accept. Morrison gestured toward the viewing galleries where representatives from dozens of minor species were watching the proceedings. How many of those beings down there have sent ambassadors to human worlds in the past year? How many have asked US about our concepts of democracy and self-determination? How many have wondered why they should accept the judgment of powers that see them as children to be managed rather than equals to be respected? The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison could see the truth of his words reflected in the faces of the alien observers. The human example had indeed inspired others to question the established order, and the tribunal knew it. I came here prepared to defend humanity's actions at Kepler Colony, Morrison continued. But after studying your archives and seeing how your system really works, I realize that defense is not enough. I'm here to offer you a choice. Zexhi's crystalline body began to pulse with dangerous energy. What choice? Morrison took a deep breath and delivered the words that would change the galaxy forever. Humanity is willing to accept restrictions on our military expansion, but only if this tribunal agrees to fundamental reforms. Include representatives from all spacefaring species in your decision-making process, not just the 12 founding members. Create a system of galactic governance based on actual representation rather than ancient privilege. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the tribunal judges began shouting at once while the other half sat in stunned silence. In the viewing galleries, representatives from minor species began to stand and cheer while the major powers' delegates looked horrified. You cannot bargain with the tribunal, Scran roared. We are the established authority of this galaxy. Morrison smiled grimly. Established by whom? You 12 species made these rules to benefit yourselves after your ancient wars nearly destroyed everything. Now you want to force everyone else to live under your authority forever. Well, here's some news for you. Humanity doesn't recognize your right to rule over us, and neither do a lot of other species. High Arbiter Zexhi's body was now blazing with fury, casting harsh shadows across the chamber walls. Are you threatening this tribunal, human? I'm offering you a chance to reform peacefully before change happens anyway, Morrison replied. Because change is coming whether you accept it or not. The question is whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. As Morrison finished speaking, he could see that he had accomplished exactly what he had set out to do. He had turned the trial from humanity's defense into an indictment of the entire galactic system. The tribunal could no longer simply punish humanity and maintain the status quo. They would have to choose between reform and revolution, and Morrison was betting they would choose poorly. The tribunal chamber had never been so quiet. President Jake Morrison stood on the defendant's platform, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy, waiting to hear their final judgment. The 12 alien judges floated on their platforms like ancient gods preparing to pronounce the fate of mortals, their various forms radiating millennia of accumulated authority. High Arbiter Zexhi rose slowly from its crystalline throne, its body pulsing with contained energy. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of galactic law and the finality of absolute power. The Galactic Tribunal has reached its decision, Zexhi announced. The species known as humanity is found guilty of violating civilized warfare protocols and demonstrating dangerous aggression that threatens galactic stability. Morrison felt Ambassador Stone tense beside him, but he remained perfectly still, his face showing no emotion as the judgment continued. Therefore, Zexhi continued, humanity is hereby restricted to its current territorial boundaries. No further expansion will be permitted. Tribunal observers will be placed on all human worlds to ensure compliance with galactic law. Any attempt at aggressive expansion beyond current borders will result in complete containment to the Sol system. The alien judges sat back on their platforms, clearly expecting the humans to bow their heads and accept this verdict with proper humility. The watching aliens in the galleries murmured among themselves, some disappointed that the sentence was not harsher, others surprised that humanity had not been completely destroyed. Morrison remained motionless for a long moment, letting the weight of their words settle over the chamber. Then, very slowly, he raised his head and looked up at the 12 judges with eyes that blazed with controlled fury. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the vast space. You crossed the limit. The simple words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion and uncertainty. Zexhi's crystalline features shifted into what might have been puzzlement. "What did you say, human?" Morrison stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight and proud despite being surrounded by beings who could destroy his entire species with a thought. "I said you crossed the limit," he repeated, his voice growing stronger. "Humanity came to this tribunal in good faith, believing we could find justice within your system. We were willing to explain our actions, to make our case, to work within the framework of galactic law. But instead of justice, we found corruption. Instead of law, we found tyranny dressed up in ancient ceremonies." The judges began to stir with anger, but Morrison continued before they could interrupt. "You want to know what humanity has been doing while your tribunal deliberated. We've been talking to other species. 43 different civilizations have contacted us in the past week, all asking the same question. Is it true that humans are planning to reject your authority?" Zexhi's body flared with dangerous light. "You dare to conspire against the established order of the galaxy?" Morrison smiled, and there was something in that expression that made even the ancient judges feel a chill of uncertainty. "Conspire? No, Your Honor. We've been doing something much more dangerous than that. We've been sharing ideas." The president activated his personal hologram projector, and suddenly the chamber was filled with images of human worlds. But these were not the military installations or weapons factories the judges might have expected. Instead, they saw schools, where alien children learned alongside human students, research facilities where scientists from dozens of species worked together on common projects, and cities where beings from across the galaxy lived in peace and equality. "While you were preparing to punish us for fighting too hard to defend our colony," Morrison said, "we were busy building something you never imagined, a coalition based on actual representation, democratic principles, and the radical idea that all intelligent beings have the right to determine their own fate." The chamber erupted in chaos as the implications of his words sank in. Several tribunal judges began shouting at once while others demanded to know what humanity had done. In the viewing galleries, representatives from minor species were on their feet cheering while the major powers, delegates looked horrified. Morrison raised his voice above the din. "As of this moment, humanity formally rejects the authority of this tribunal and withdraws from all galactic treaties imposed without our consent. Furthermore, the Coalition of Free Worlds, representing 43 species and over 200 billion beings, no longer recognizes your jurisdiction over our territories or our actions." Warlord Scran leaped to his feet, his reptilian features twisted with rage. "This is rebellion. We will crush your pathetic coalition within months. The combined fleets of the tribunal species will reduce your worlds to ash." Morrison's smile widened, and now there was something predatory in his expression that made the ancient warlord take an involuntary step backward. "Will you now? That's an interesting threat, considering the current position of your fleets." The president activated another holographic display, and suddenly the chamber was filled with a three-dimensional map of the galaxy showing the current positions of military forces. The tribunal judges stared in shock at what they saw. Coalition fleets were positioned near the home systems of each of the 12 ruling species, not to attack, but to defend the minor species worlds that had declared independence. "You see," Morrison explained conversationally, "while you were busy preparing for this trial, we were preparing for this moment. Every species that joined our coalition has been quietly moving their defensive forces into position. We now have mutual defense agreements with nearly half the galaxy, and they're all ready to fight for their freedom." Zexhi's crystalline body was now blazing with fury, casting harsh shadows across the chamber walls. "You cannot threaten the tribunal. We are the legitimate authority of this galaxy." Morrison's expression grew cold and hard. "Legitimate? You 12 species carved up the galaxy among yourselves after your ancient wars and then had the nerve to call it law. You've spent 10,000 years growing fat and comfortable while keeping everyone else under your boot. Well, your reign is over. The president turned to address the entire chamber, his voice ringing with the authority of someone who had just changed the course of history. For too long, this galaxy has been ruled by fear and ancient privilege. Today, that ends. The Coalition of Free Worlds offers a new path, genuine representation, democratic governance, and the recognition that all intelligent beings are created equal. Several of the tribunal judges were now on their feet, their various forms radiating rage and disbelief. The gas being representative of the Aetherans sparked with electrical discharges as it spoke through its translation device. "You have doomed the galaxy to chaos and war," it thundered. "The peace we have maintained for millennia will be shattered." Morrison shook his head. "No, Your Honor. We've simply offered beings a choice between freedom and slavery, and they've chosen freedom. The only question now is whether you'll accept the new reality peacefully, or try to maintain your power through force." He gestured toward the holographic display showing the coalition fleets. "If you choose force, you'll find yourselves fighting on dozens of fronts against species that have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. If you choose peace, you'll find that there's still a place for you in the galaxy, just not as its rulers." High Arbiter Zexhi's voice cut through the chaos like a blade of pure sound. "This tribunal does not negotiate with rebels and terrorists." Morrison looked up at the crystalline being with something that might have been pity. "Then you've chosen poorly, Your Honor. History will remember this day as the moment when the galaxy chose freedom over fear, democracy over tyranny, and hope over the dead weight of ancient privilege." The president turned toward the exit, followed by Ambassador Stone and Colonel Johnson. As they walked away from the platform where humanity had been condemned, Morrison called back over his shoulder. "Oh, and Your Honors. When you're sitting in the ruins of your old system, wondering where it all went wrong, remember this. You could have reformed peacefully when we offered you the chance. Instead, you chose to cross the limit." As the human delegation left the chamber, the ancient tribunal sat in stunned silence, watching 10,000 years of galactic order crumble around them. Behind them, representatives from dozens of species were already leaving to return to their worlds with news of the revolution that had just begun. Outside the tribunal station, the USS Washington prepared for departure, its mission complete. President Morrison stood on the observation deck, looking out at the stars where coalition fleets were beginning their journey home. The galaxy would never be the same again, and humanity had just ensured that freedom would have a chance to flourish. Among the stars,